one of the great scientists that has appeared on our show before, that has absolutely nothing to gain for telling the truth, a world-renowned cardiologist who has time and time again been on the news trying to wake us up, saying, I am not anti-science, I am the epitome of science. I'm trying to draw attention. Before there was a meeting in DC showing all the injuries, before there was many of the other pundits that are out there starting to change their mind, before even, Joe Rogan decided to have an honest conversation about this, there was Peter McCullough, and he is everywhere.
Joining me now is Dr. Peter McCullough.
Dr. Peter McCullough.
Dr. Peter McCullough.
Dr. Peter McCullough.
Internist and cardiologist. He's been spearheading efforts to get this countervailing perspective in front of Congress.
Where's the conversation about the treatment of COVID-19?
Patients actually think that the virus is untreatable. And so what happens is they go out to get a diagnosis. Now, I'm a COVID survivor. My wife in the galley is a COVID survivor. My father in a nursing home is a COVID survivor. You get handed a diagnostic test. It says, here, you're COVID positive. Go home. Is there any treatment? No. That's the standard of care in the United States.
Hydroxychloroquine is the most frequently prescribed drug for this condition worldwide. It's the most studied drug.
I can tell you firsthand, hydroxychloroquine does not cause giant scars in the heart. There have been cases all over the country of doctors trying to help patients. And hydroxychloroquine is one of 4 to 6 drugs we use for COVID-19. It is extraordinary. There's not a single media doctor on TV who's ever treated a COVID patient. Not a single one. There's not a single person in the White House task force has ever treated a patient. Lancet published a fake paper that came from a fake database that implied that hydroxychloroquine hurt people in the hospital. And we looked at it in 2 seconds. I knew it was a fake paper.
I don't want anybody to think that the myocarditis of the natural infection is anything like what we're seeing with the vaccines. It's a totally different syndrome.
We're 6 months into the vaccine program, and we've had no detailed press briefing on vaccine safety. We've had 21,000 hospitalizations. The vaccine has no protective effect against the Delta variant. It's no time to rush out and get the vaccine.
America has to wake up right here, right now.
Well, you've seen him all over Fox News and different media channels speaking the truth, bringing in science, making it understandable to everybody. And I am so happy to be here in a conversation at this critical time right now. So, Doctor, thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me, Dom. I'm Dr. Peter McCullough. I'm an academic internist, cardiologist, and a trained epidemiologist in practice in Dallas, Texas, but I'm very involved in the COVID-19 pandemic response, and my analyses have been relied upon by the U.S. Senate, many state houses of legislation. And as you've pointed out, I've been asked in a lot of different media venues to give a particular analysis now on vaccine safety and efficacy.
And you're doing an amazing job at it. And I think what's been so great for all of us in media, and certainly, alternate media, whatever you want to call it, but just media in general, your ability to sort of bring facts that we can count on. So much of the information you've provided us here at the High Wire, we're able to look it up and say, there it is, there's the science. So while we're speaking about science, I mean, this may be, I think, a week that will live in infamy. We just on Tuesday watched as the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices approved the vaccine for the use in children, the COVID vaccine, of course, in 5 to 11-year-olds. Just last week, obviously, the FDA had sort of approved an emergency use authorization, and now it's being followed up by the CDC, which we now know whether or not there's, people on these committees are like, well, I don't want a mandate, but I would like it available to people, which was some of the arguments that have been made. We know there's going to be mandates on children, probably starting in California, where Gavin Newsom has said as soon as this is available for children, I'm going to mandate it to get into school. So now children are, going to be directly in the firing line of this lightly tested at best vaccine, has not been through long-term safety studies. But unlike many of the conversations, the concerns of long-term issues, which we've addressed on the High Wire, there are real short-term issues that have been visible to the naked eye right in front of us, and that is this issue of myocarditis, pericarditis, this heart inflammation problem in children, which is what you've been speaking about a lot. So first of all, what are your thoughts on the advisory committee on immunization practices? These are your peers. These are people just like you that went through medical school. Of course, you have this, deep understanding of the heart that has been your specialty. But as you saw them vote 14-0, nobody thinking it might be a bad idea to give this vaccinations to children. What are your thoughts right now?
I'm a graduate of University of Texas Southwestern, and from there I went on to University of Washington in Seattle. In the 80s, it was the #1 medicine training program in the United States, just ahead of the Harvard programs. And many of my fellow residents went on to the CDC to be CDC officers. I went off and did a tour of rural health, and then did my public health training at University of Michigan, and then on to cardiology training. So we're really kind of equal backgrounds. And I think it's important for the listeners to understand, that the CDC is not like the Supreme Court. The CDC is an outbreak investigation organization, and they do provide some guidance, but it's not considered high-level guidance in medicine. So, for instance, the CDC recommends, that we have less than 10% of our calories in sugar and saturated fat. For instance, they have dietary recommendations. It's not considered high-level recommendations. So I wouldn't think a CDC vote on a vaccine should carry much weight because the CDC in general is just not a treating organization. They do not have members who are actually treating patients, making clinical decisions, or fielding the issues of risks and benefits. That being said, in the pandemic, the CDC, the FDA, and the NIH have, in a sense, almost grown in power in terms of their recommendations as they come down to the public. And what we know so far in all of the meetings since the registrational trials in adults, so that includes the booster meetings, that includes ages 12 to 17, and now ages 5 to 11. All of those data have been with the legacy variants, have been with the Wuhan wild-type spike protein, and then the alpha, beta, and some gamma. There are no randomized trials, none, and certainly no studies with any meaningful clinical outcomes with the Delta variant. And the Delta variant now is basically here to stay. It's 99% of the mutant strains that we have. It's basically crowded out all the others because it's thriving among the vaccinated. And so you can imagine having all this decision and data regarding antibody titers, regarding really pretty meager clinical outcomes, the occurrence of the upper respiratory infection, the cold, if you will, of COVID-19, in these different data sets, all being from the legacy variants. And we know that the vaccines in adults actually did have some protection against the legacy variant upper respiratory tract illness. We knew out of registrational trials it had about 90% vaccine efficacy. And in a paper by
Let me be clear, because I want to make sure our audience understands what you just said. When we say 90% efficacy, when we think vaccination, we think that means it's 90% effective at making sure that I'm immune to the disease, that I don't catch it, I can't transmit it. But what you're saying, it's 90% effective at handling the symptoms of the disease, not the infection. I'm still going to catch the infection, but I won't, go through maybe serious symptoms.
Right. So let me clarify. This is important, though. So let me clarify. So in the registrational trials, let's just take the adult trials. These were trials where they recruited people who were interested in being in research, and they could have received the active immunization or placebo.
Right.
And in general, they were fastidious. I mean, the rates of infection, of just the binary infection of getting the cold, if you will, of COVID-19, was less than 1% in both groups. But what I mean by vaccine efficacy, if there were 100 upper respiratory tract infections in the placebo group, then there would be 10 in the vaccine group. That would be 90% vaccine efficacy. You're right. It's just been mistranslated. People think it's 90% protection, but it's not, because I can tell you when it's less than 1% of people who got the infection, that means very, very few people were exposed to COVID-19. And that was in an era where we had 5, 10, 15% laboratory positive rates. So what I'm telling you is the registrational trials were not a very good challenge of protection.
Right.
And so sure enough, that's what we've seen now in the population. In the adults, we've seen a giant waning of protection. That's based on two things. One is based on the mutation to Delta, which
Right.
is greatly resistant to the vaccines, and Delta can thrive in the nose and mouth of those who are vaccinated. And based on another problem is the immunization itself with the current genre of vaccines is not long lasting. And there are very good data. A paper by Nordstrom and colleagues from Sweden had 1.6 million matched pairs of vaccinated versus unvaccinated. And what they showed with Pfizer and Moderna is they went from vaccine efficacies of over 90% initially, dropping considerably down. Pfizer, after 210 days, dropped below 30%. Moderna dropped considerably, I believe, below 70%. And a paper by Israel and colleagues from Israel showed that the antibodies dropped by 40% per month with Pfizer. And we know antibodies against the spike protein is a very partial form of immunity. With a natural infection, we have a full library of antibodies against all the fundamental components of the vaccine. Plus, we have robust T-cell immunity against the nucleocapsid, natural killer cells. We have the full armamentarium. And now in the Brownstone Institute, Paul Alexander's accumulated 91 studies supporting natural immunity, robust, complete, and durable.